Good morning. My name is Tom Oldfather. I'm the Communications Manager here at NYSAC. Welcome to today's virtual fall seminar workshop on utilizing new tools of communication during the COVID-19 pandemic. On behalf of our President, Jack Marin, and Executive Director, Stephen Aquario, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. We're on day 3 of our virtual fall seminar, which is taking place through the end of September and includes nearly 20 workshops and meetings designed to bring the latest information on issues facing today's county leaders. We thank you all for joining us as we move counties forward together. Before we get to the workshop, we've got some housekeeping. On the screen now, you can see our social media channels. If you don't already, please follow us so you can stay up to date on the latest from NYSAC, both during this conference and also throughout the year as we work to educate, advocate for, and serve our members. We also encourage everyone to show their participation in the fall seminar by joining in our virtual contests for a chance to win prizes from our sponsors. For those of you on Twitter, we have the weekly tweet off. Whoever tweets the most times throughout the week using the hashtag #CountiesForwardTogether will win a prize from a sponsor. And this week's prize is a JBL Bluetooth speaker. So be sure to get in on that. For those of you on Instagram, we're hosting a Counties Forward Together photo contest. To participate, you simply post a photo about how your county is moving forward with the hashtag #CountiesForwardTogether and tagging us at NYS Counties. Winning photo will be selected at the end of the conference and win a prize from our sponsor. And then our last opportunity to win prizes is our Perfect Attendance Award. So if you've attended both the workshops in the last 2 days, you're still eligible for the Perfect Attendance Award. And at the end of the conference, we'll do a random drawing from everybody who attended all the workshops for a prize from our sponsor. So you can learn more about all these contests at nysac.org/contests. And then before we get to our featured speakers, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor of this workshop, Securus Monitoring Solutions. Law enforcement and community correction agencies from across the United States turn to Securus Monitoring Solutions when they want to more efficiently and effectively manage their offender populations. Throughout the crisis of this ongoing pandemic, customers have to rely on their expertise to provide solutions that cover the spectrum of offender management. From smartphone-based location verification tools to next-generation GPS monitoring platforms that provide 24/7 real-time offender monitoring, Securus Monitoring Solutions has the robust solutions to manage your offender populations and keep your community safe. To learn more about Securus Monitoring Solutions, visit securusmonitoring.com. All right. So for today, the novel coronavirus pandemic created unprecedented need for clear, consistent communications with the public, while simultaneously disrupting many of the traditional tools and methods employed by government communicators. In this session, you'll learn how social media platforms and other digital resources enabled effective crisis communication during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how those tools and techniques can be incorporated into communication strategies moving forward as counties adapt to a new normal of government operations in a socially distanced world. So today we're very lucky to be joined by 2 very talented communications professionals from both the state government and one from the county government level, who will share their perspective, experiences, and insights around working in communications during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and how they incorporated new tools to achieve their communication goals. So we'll hear from both of them and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So as you listen to the presentations, please type your questions into the question panel in the webinar dashboard on the right side of your screen. Just fire them away as you think of them. I know I always forget questions, if I'm trying to wait till the very end. So go ahead and ask them, and then we'll go through at the end and get to those. For our first speaker, as we all know, Governor Cuomo became a fixture on cable and broadcast news with his daily coronavirus briefings, but his office also undertook an aggressive and engaging social media communication strategy to deliver important information to the public. And here to talk about that, we have Andrew Mitchell. Andrew is the Deputy Communications Director for Digital at the Office of Governor Andrew M. Cuomo. Previously, he served as Digital Communications Strategist and Digital Communications Manager, having joined the Governor's Office in 2017. Before that, he worked as an editor at the news outlet Mike. He earned his bachelor's degree in English from the University of Chicago. So thank you, Andrew, for sparing some time from your very busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning. So throughout COVID, I was responsible, along with my team, for the governor's digital communications, which consists of social media, our SMS program, our email program, video content, as well as special initiatives that included TV ads, billboards, etc. I want to add as a disclaimer that I'm speaking purely my own opinions and my own experience. Next slide, please. To start, I want to bring us back to the very beginning of this year, to the early days of COVID, because I think it'll be useful to remind ourselves of what those days actually felt like as we were living through them, and not how we view them today in hindsight. Next slide, please. Here's a timeline of some of the key dates in the first part of the year that will help orient this discussion. You can read along, but I'll just go through quickly. January 9th, the World Health Organization announces a mysterious virus in Wuhan. January 21st, the first confirmed case in the United States in Washington. January 31st, the first confirmed case in Italy. March 1st was when New York had its first COVID patient. That was almost exactly 200 days ago. March 3rd was the second confirmed case in New York, an attorney from New Rochelle who accidentally spread it around New Rochelle. On March 7th, Governor Cuomo declared a state of emergency, and on the 10th, he implemented a containment zone around New Rochelle. On March 11th, the World Health Organization officially declared COVID a pandemic. On the 14th, the first person died of COVID in New York. On the 16th, gyms, restaurants, bars, and movie theaters were ordered to close. On the 18th, schools were ordered to close. And on the 20th, New York entered what we called New York on pause, which was essentially a stay-at-home order for the entire state. So we all remember this and we lived through it, but there are two interesting things to note from this timeline. First, the month of February isn't even on here. It was kind of a lost month. The CDC was working on tests that were bungled at first, and after they did have a working test, samples from suspected COVID positive patients were actually being FedExed to the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta, and only people who had arrived from places like China or Italy or Iran could get tested. The second thing to note is that in March, the virus very quickly went from being seen as a containable outbreak to being a pandemic that was out of control, and then the only rational response was to shut down everything. I think the speed at which that transition happened is really shocking, and people forget it. And I also think it played a big role in our response from a communications angle. Most of the major announcements that we had to explain to New Yorkers actually happened in the span of less than 10 days. One of the things the governor has said many times during this pandemic, and I agree with him, is that rules and orders and regulations only work if the public is behind them. And so the job of communications really can only be effective when you're speaking to a receptive audience, or at least a persuadable one. So now I'm going to show you two slides that I think illustrate how Americans and New Yorkers viewed the virus at first, and then the moment that the public opinion switched in the blink of an eye, and it was truly seen as a major crisis. So next slide, please. So the first slide, you might remember this this photo. It's a lot of construction vehicles getting ready to build a hospital in Wuhan in less than a week, which they did do. To me, this photo exemplifies our fascination then, and the media's fascination as well, with the Chinese response to the virus. Many people thought at the time thought that if anyone could contain a virus like this, the authoritarian Chinese government would be up to the task. And I think as Westerners generally, China felt like someplace far away and remote, and so the virus also felt far away and remote. Now the next slide, you can go to the next slide, shows three things that happened in one day, March 11th, which I believe was the exact day that public opinion shifted dramatically. I think you'll remember this day as well. So three things happened. First, President Trump gave an address from the Oval Office in which he announced he was canceling flights from Europe to the United States. Second, the NBA canceled their season. And then the third thing that happened was Tom Hanks and his wife announced that they had coronavirus. So the last one's a bit less important, but I really think that three of those things happening all in a single day was a wake-up call for Americans who said, okay, this thing is actually serious and we're going to be in this for a while. So it's kind of an inflection point in my mind. Even then, I don't think any of us quite expected how bad it would get. Next slide, please. So for the first part of this presentation, I want to address what the governor's digital communications efforts consisted of during the worst period of the crisis, from about mid-March to the end of April. After that, I'll talk about how we've continued to refine our message throughout the reopening process and over the summer. And finally, I'll talk about some of what I think we learned, or what I think I learned at any rate during this ordeal. Next slide, please. Crisis mode. You can go to the next slide. One of the first things our team did in March was to develop what you're seeing now, which was a simple, catchy slogan to get people to follow the stay-at-home order. So stay home, stop the spread, save lives. We came up with this on March 15th, and we were, to my knowledge, the first people to use this exact slogan, although it's not, extremely original. This slogan started as something that we used in our social media graphics, but it was then added to the bottom of the slides on the PowerPoint presentations that the governor was giving every day. So this message was reinforced over and over and over again on every PowerPoint slide, at the bottom of almost every graphic we put out, at the end of videos, wherever we could find a place to put it, we did. I think the simplicity of the message worked. We also used a color that we called coronavirus red to emphasize the danger of the crisis. Next slide, please. In the next slide, you can see that this same message was adopted pretty much by everyone. So here are examples from Louisiana, from Minnesota, from New Mexico, and from Britain. In Britain, they changed the idea slightly, and they came up with the slogan, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. Unfortunately, we don't have any kind of NHS-like thing here. So most of what we did during March was tweeting constant updates from the governor's daily press conferences in real time, which we also shared on Instagram and other platforms. So every press conference the governor gave was streamed live on Twitter and Facebook, and we built a loyal audience on those platforms by doing so. Next slide, please. We also used social media to amplify the governor's calls for supplies of PPE and other equipment that there were severe shortages of, as you can see here, the graphic on the right. We individually replied to hundreds of messages from potential leads on LinkedIn and other platforms so that promising offers could be relayed to the team that was overseeing the procurement of essential supplies. Sometimes this happened purely because of social media interactions. Next slide, please. For example, as you can see on this slide, the fashion designer Christian Siriano tweeted that if the governor says we need masks, he and his team are happy to help and sew them. So we DM'd Christian Siriano on Twitter and ended up forging a successful partnership with Mr. Siriano, whose workshop went on to make thousands of masks. So this is an example of an impactful tweet and social media interaction that directly led to a real, or something that was real. Next slide, please. Another thing we decided to do early on was to create a new email product specifically for COVID updates. The first coronavirus email update was sent on March 17th, and we sent them every night, and we still do. The email list grew extremely quickly. It started at 0. We now have over 400,000 subscribers, and we have an extremely high open rate of about 50%, which is pretty much unheard of. And I think that shows that there's such an interest and desire to get the information straight from the source. The emails include all the news that New Yorkers need to know about COVID, as well as a positive news story at the end of each email to add some levity, so that the email isn't too serious and grim. Despite the fact that writing nightly emails was a significant investment of time for our small team, I believe the emails helped build trust and credibility with our audience, and New Yorkers generally, who were able to count on getting the information they needed every night in a short email. So definitely sign up for this email if you haven't already. Next slide, please. Digital ads. We were fortunate in that both Facebook and Google gave the State Department of Health substantial ad coupons to spend to spread awareness about the risks of COVID. I think it was a few $1 million worth of coupons. So the goal of the ads that we placed was to emphasize the severity of the virus so that people took it seriously, they stayed inside, and they listened to us. We worked alongside a very competent group of friends at an agency that offered their help pro bono. And what we did is we actually took the list of zip codes that had been hit hardest by COVID, and we spent almost 100% of the coupons that Facebook had given us targeting those specific zip codes. Through A/B testing and through various different ads that we ran, we found that the ads that mentioned a specific location got better results than the generic ads that didn't specify location. So you can see on the screen, these ones say Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, but otherwise they're identical. These ads on the screen, they're also, definitely full-on scare tactics. So the message here is someone you love could be next. It has a picture of someone being ventilated. So it's definitely blunt, but it got people's attention when we really needed it to. Next slide, please. During this period, we wanted to reach New Yorkers in whatever way we could. So we used highway signs, which you may have seen. We got popular DJs to make announcements about COVID on their radio shows in English and Spanish. We partnered with Snap Inc. to get special Snapchat geofilters made for the entire state of New York that included our COVID messaging. We worked with DoorDash, FreshDirect, and other delivery services to include paper flyers in all of their deliveries with COVID information from the Department of Health. We had billboards and other out-of-home campaigns for whoever might be going outside. This list on this slide is not exhaustive, and I don't have time to go into all of these efforts, but I mention this to say that there are always more tools in the toolbox, and during a crisis, we wanted to use as many tools as we could think of to reach as many New Yorkers as possible. Next slide, please. Of course, the message did have to shift at a certain point. Next slide. As the economy began to reopen and the stay-at-home order ended, we changed our slogan, stay home, stop the spread, save lives, to what you see on this slide, wear a mask, stop the spread, save lives. And then we changed it again, actually, to wear a mask, get tested, save lives, to incorporate another one of our messages. So really, for the entirety of the summer and up to today, wear a mask has been one of the top messages that we've said over and over again. New York was the first state to have a national mask mandate. And similarly in our communications, we've also placed an extremely large emphasis on masks and mask wearing. Next slide, please. The governor launched a contest where any New Yorker could submit a 30-second wear a mask PSA via social media. And it was really successful. We got over 600 people to submit videos to this contest. Eventually, 3 finalists were chosen, and New Yorkers were able to vote online for their favorite ad. So Rachel Maddow did a segment on this contest, and she pointed out that, despite the public health experts all saying that mask wearing is extremely effective and one of the best things that we can all do, there had been almost no concerted efforts by anyone, certainly not at the federal level, to get this message across. But she said, New York is an exception and one of the few places that is doing that. So that was really gratifying for our team to hear. Next slide, please. Some of our highest performing tweets from the late spring and summer were about masks. Just to read the first tweet aloud. Healthcare workers wear masks for 5+ hours nonstop. You can wear one for 45 minutes. That particular tweet relies on a sort of outrage and shamey aspect to Twitter, which can be very powerful to tap into, but it can also backfire if you do it too often. Next slide, please. To continue with this mask push, we launched a campaign called Mask Up America, which is a series of PSAs produced in-house that are aimed at a national audience. The campaign mostly relied on stock footage or footage our team shot with the voiceovers of celebrities, including Morgan Freeman, Robert De Niro, Billy Crystal, Ellen Pompeo, and others. The videos were then distributed by the Ad Council for TV networks to air. And I think they've been aired something like 22 million times already. What's interesting here is that we actually based many of the scripts of these PSAs on specific tweets that we had posted about masks and that had struck a chord and performed very well, like the one that I just read out loud. So in other words, our content on social media ended up influencing the content of this national PSA campaign. Next slide, please. As you can see in this next slide, this change of messaging was across the board and was also reflected in highway signs. This particular sign was slightly more playful and was used in New York City. Next slide, please. Now let's move on from the topic of masks. On June 19th, the governor ended his daily COVID briefings, which also presented a challenge for us, as so much of our social content was driven around and by the daily press briefing. So many people watched his briefings that we felt it was important to continue a daily update on Twitter to provide New Yorkers with the top line COVID numbers every day. So we developed what you're looking at now, this chart that's sort of loosely based on the governor's PowerPoint aesthetics. And since the briefings have ended, we've continued to tweet these updates on the numbers every single day. I think this is interesting. It's sometimes the worst performing tweet that we post on a day. So we're not doing it for the engagement, but we see it as really valuable in maintaining the governor's channels as a source for real-time information on COVID, even as the situation has improved. Next slide, please. So other messages were important to get out as well, including the fact that we needed people to cooperate with contact tracers in the event of getting called by one of them. So one of the biggest challenges that tracers face is simply getting people to pick up their phones. So the graphic shown on this slide is an attempt to use humor to influence that behavior. I'll give you a second to read it. Next slide, please. Finally, we developed an integrated out-of-home campaign by partnering with the ad agency TBWA Shy a Day that was called It's Up to Us New York. The point of this campaign was to reiterate the importance not just of mask wearing, but also some of the basic tips that help prevent the spread of COVID that we felt that many people still were either unaware of or had become kind of relaxed about, including social distancing, hand washing, and things like that. We also used kind of a friendly color scheme, and we wanted to make these ads seem approachable and not like New York State was shouting at you too much. The slogan, It's Up to Us, which I don't have a picture of, was intended to remind New Yorkers that we all individually have a responsibility in helping reduce the spread. So these ads were on billboards across New York City, including in Times Square. They were in the subway stations. They were at JFK and LaGuardia Airport. They were on the TVs that you see in the back of yellow taxis, and they were also on elevator screens that you see in the elevators of office buildings. Next slide, please. Great. So what we learned. I hope none of us, by the way, will need any kind of pandemic communications toolkit in the future. That being said, there are some broader insights from this crisis that I think would apply to a number of other circumstances and are also just generally good practices. Next slide, please. So one of the great questions, how do you get people to listen to you? We took a kind of spaghetti on the wall approach to our content. What worked, we kept on doing. What didn't work, we stopped doing. But we really did try to use all the various ways of persuading people that we could think of. So what do I think works best? All of the above. We had success by appealing to naked self-interest as well as civic-mindedness. We had success by making people laugh, and we had success by making people worried. Some people on Twitter responded to the hard facts. Some people wanted more of an emotional argument. So one of the reasons to do a healthy mix is that you'll reach slightly different audiences actually by doing so, because people share things in different patterns. One of the reasons I put so much emphasis at the beginning of this presentation on the day, March 11th, when I think public opinion on COVID shifted so quickly, is because it demonstrates that external events, even ones that are coincidental or arbitrary, must first take place to get people to change how they look at a particular issue. So that's usually out of one's own control. But if we think of social media as a collection of people responding to external events as they happen, then the most effective way to communicate on social is to pay close attention to the reactions to events and to tap into the sentiments that ebb and flow in the wake of them. The key is in posting the right message at the right moment. It is more of an art than a science, and so testing out the waters with a range of content is a good way at better understanding which sentiments resonate with your audience and which ones fall flat. Next slide, please. There's nothing quite like a powerful story. One of the moments that caught me by surprise during this ordeal was a press briefing during which the governor read out loud a letter that a farmer from Kansas had written to him and had sent to him along with an N95 mask. Next slide, please. The letters on the slide, probably impossible to read, but essentially this farmer was old and his wife is sick, and only had one lung, and they were giving away one of their 5 N95 masks to the people of New York. So I suppose I was a bit cynical at first when I found out that the governor was going to read this letter out loud in his briefing. I thought the whole thing seemed a little bit cheesy, but I really couldn't have been more wrong. The reaction to the letter was incredible. It was the most viral thing we'd ever seen at that point on our social channels. And this story really did show America at its best, and it inspired a lot of people. So my broader takeaway from that is that if you can tell a powerful story, oftentimes someone else's story, then you can win people over. This was a letter that was just plucked out of hundreds of letters, and it's almost just sort of lucky that they happened to see it and read it and recognize it for what it was. So, this story, this narrative was about a particular farmer named Dennis taking a specific kind-hearted action. But it was also a general story too about helping fellow Americans in a time when that seems increasingly rare. So stories like this one strike a chord where other content falls short. Next slide, please. Partnerships, and you can go to the next slide, actually. We could not have done this, and we could not have reached as many people as we did with our messaging without the help of so many partners, many of whom offered their help unsolicited, others who we asked for help and they kindly agreed. Not everyone did, but the various companies that helped us with creative, with ad placement, with distribution and more made a massive impact. And we were very, very lucky to have their help. And I think it just shows that, like, in a crisis, it's really important to reach out to people and to manage these relationships because you're going to need more than just your own staff. And building these partnerships can really make a huge impact. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll conclude this presentation, and I apologize to Tom if I've gone over time with some general thoughts on social media, which I think has been a pretty destructive force overall to society and to public discourse. So the social media platforms have allowed misinformation to spread, and to go even further, they've led to a complete collapse in trust in traditional forms of journalism and reporting, not to mention decimating the local news industry. So in our current online ecosystem, falsehoods are more viral than facts. A misleading headline gets more clicks than an accurate one. And the vast majority of Americans and New Yorkers receive their news through an algorithm that gives them what it thinks they want to read or watch and suppresses viewpoints and stories that might challenge their existing beliefs and politics. When the governor tweets, we are tweeting essentially people who are left-leaning. When a prominent Republican official tweets, they too are tweeting primarily to similarly minded people. I'm sure you're all aware of this, and I can only say that to work in digital communications right now, you have to be very cognizant of this unfortunate reality and act accordingly. I highly recommend direct email outreach as a tonic to the toxicity and polarization of the social media platforms, because developing that direct connection to constituents is a way of building trust while avoiding trolls and negative replies. But on the public platforms, there's not quite as much that you can do. Still, it's not entirely hopeless. It helps, I think, to communicate the hard facts, to transparently provide data and information, to acknowledge the things that you do not know along with the things that you know, and to have a sense of humor now and then. So then maybe you'll be able to break through at least some of the polarization and gain more trust with the people you're trying to reach. Because ultimately, and especially in times of crisis, whether you're a communications director, a social media guy like me, or a county executive, you need to reach everyone and not only the people who already agree with you. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's fantastic. So next up, we will hear from Justin Sales from the Office of Onondaga County Executive Ryan McMahon. County Executive McMahon's office led one of the most consistent county-level communications efforts during the pandemic, holding daily COVID briefings from early March through early June, at which point they backed down to just several times a week. Their office was on the leading edge of initiatives to set up drive-through testing sites and institute voluntary shelter-in-place policies to attempt to starve the virus. These are just two examples of what I'm sure were many policies that required extensive and effective public outreach. And here to talk about those efforts is Justin Sales. Justin started communications for Onondaga County in a limited capacity in 2016 and eventually worked his way up to Executive Communications Director in 2018 under the prior Onondaga County Executive, and was retained in that role upon the appointment and subsequent election of County Executive McMahon. Justin notes that County Executive McMahon has placed a significantly greater emphasis on communicating directly with the people of Onondaga County, as well as with the local and regional media, making the role of Executive Communications Director especially challenging, but also rewarding. I'm about to turn it over to Justin, but just one more plug to ask your questions. Go ahead and get those in now as you think about them, so that we can have some questions for these guys at the end. All right, Justin, take it away.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Andrew. And before I guess get going, the one thing I would say is the approach that New York State took with their social media and their media in general allowed folks like County Executive McMahon, when he was talking to the public, to take the much more local or regional approach in communicating with the public. So in other words, neither one of us had to reinvent the wheel, which I think overall made the communication with the public all that more successful. So that being said, this is a webinar on social media. I think it would be irresponsible not to do a completely shameless plug to follow Onondaga County on Twitter or Facebook. So as you can see, feel free to give us a like or a follow. Next slide. Next. So there seems to be a playbook for a lot of things these days that folks can either turn to and say, why aren't you following this? Or why are you following this? There is no playbook for community during a pandemic. And what was helpful, at least here on the local level, is that the media here got that. It's called a 100-year pandemic for a reason. Even if there was a playbook, you're not going to communicate with the community in 2020 as they did in 1918, which made the role of social media all the more important. What I will say to that in addition is the glass half full to all of this is the likes and follows that Onondaga County got and the emphasis we placed on social media has resulted in us being able to get other important messages, whether it's COVID related or not, out to the public. One of the things we realized very early on, which still amazes me, quite frankly, is we streamed through YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter the county executive's briefings every day, and we still do for his briefings. And actually, we now do that for almost all of his press conferences, regardless of the topic. But what was interesting is we noticed folks tuned in, listened to what the county executive had to say, got the information, and a significant portion of them, when we turned it over to questions from the media, tuned out, which you would sort of think the opposite. They might want to hear the back and forth, the Q&A, but folks were very hungry for just the straight facts and information. We were fortunate. I would, respectfully suggest the governor experienced the same thing. There was an immediate trust that the public placed in the county executive, in the governor, and it was our job essentially not to mess it up. And so it made the communication aspect through social media incredibly important. Next slide. So relationship with the media. We all come to doing this job to the table with relationships that already exist with the media, whether they are good, bad, or indifferent. But a pandemic requires a complete reset with whatever the preconceived notions or relationships might be with the media. And I would argue, at least here in Central New York, the media responded the same way. So whether I might have had a more contentious relationship with the reporter or a more amicable relationship, both got completely reset. And that proved to be incredibly beneficial to do my job, but also it helped the media to do their job because they have an interest in telling the story and the facts. And just to give you a couple of examples, the number of off the record conversations I have had with the media increased exponentially. And some of the memories I have about it are difficult in the sense that when we first had to start announcing neighbors that had passed away, it was important that we let the media know prior to the county executive going live on his briefings, because we wanted them to understand the severity of the situation, but also be prepared to inform the public on their end and not be caught off guard. I also will fully admit the number of times I had to tell the media, we don't know what we don't know. This is a 100-year pandemic. There, again, is no playbook for it. And we will get you what you're looking for as soon as we're able to get it ourselves. And admitting that, I think the phrase we used often here was building the airplane in the air. Garnered more respect from the media, but also from the public. The county executive had no problem admitting, and we saw that respect in our social media feeds from people in the Facebook comments or in the Twitter mentions, because they knew that this was something completely new, and they would rather you admit you don't know something than make something up and prove to be just completely full of it. And then when you do that, you start to lose the respect that and trust that you've garnered from the public. On the flip side, your on the record conversations become incredibly important with the public. And I say with the public because, again, that is where the social media aspect drove the community conversation to a very large degree. Sure, you're talking to the press, you're talking to, our local news stations and newspapers, but more importantly, especially with social media, you are talking to the public. And so it's important, like I said, you admit you don't know what you don't know and you'll figure it out. But at the same breath, you have to tell them some hard details and some hard facts that are not easy to explain, such as saying that someone has lost their life, or you don't know when we might be able to get back to whatever the normal will be. You have to be able to have that honest discourse. Next slide. So how did we choose to communicate and why here in Onondaga County? So before the severity of COVID, I think, was fully appreciated, we did press conferences essentially as needed in our conference room. It was before masks and social distancing. It was before our first case. We would tell the public, what our general plan was if we saw it, when we would close schools. And then it hit Onondaga County, and we had to completely pivot, because now there was a thirst for information as quickly as we could give it to the public. So we started doing Facebook briefings at noon with the county executive, the health commissioner, and our commissioner of emergency management, Dan Weirs, where we would give the data and the information we had as of that time every day. And then what we saw is the media tuned into those Facebook briefings and then followed up with a million questions, which became like drinking water from a fire hydrant. And it was very difficult because the information was coming in so quickly. We wanted to get it out, and at the same time, we needed to respond to questions from the media that they were seeing that might end up being irrelevant questions because the data changed that quickly. So then we switched to noon Facebook and 3 p.m. daily press conferences. That we learned quite frankly, was too much, which might seem odd, but there is such thing as too much information all at once. So we relatively quickly stopped doing the noon Facebook updates, and we switched to the daily briefings every day, 7 days a week, like clockwork. I mean, even to this day, if the county executive is not at the podium by 3:02, the Facebook comments are hot with looking for where he is, because people have come to rely on a 3 p.m. briefing every day from the county executive. Next slide. So lessons learned, and where are we now? Like I said, we learned it's okay to say, I don't know. The public was hungry for the facts, not the news story. Social media is your friend. I repeat all of those things because I think it's important that we're in an age, probably, or an era, whatever word you want to use, at least for the foreseeable future, where a significant portion of the population is still going to be uncomfortable going back to normal, whatever you want to consider that to be. And so what we've seen here, at least in central New York, is people relying more than ever on social media for information. Now, when I say on social media, I don't mean some of the things that Andrew may have been alluding to. I mean, they're looking for their local leader giving that update. And whether it is a live press conference that's streamed, or if it's someone just recording a daily or weekly message that's put on social media that your constituents can turn to and get some real information straight from the source, there is a level of comfort and trust that I would argue, have an obligation to give the public, but at the same time that they need and deserve. The last thing, the email, phone calls, and then the elected leader. The phone calls and emails to our office, and I should have added social media questions and comments, were unprecedented. What was particularly rewarding is that our county executive engaged right with the public. So he gets the emails that we get from the public, asking questions, asking concerns, criticisms, compliments, and he answers them himself as much as he can. And the number of people who were stunned at that level of engagement, but appreciative that the guy they were seeing at 3 o'clock every day was also the same guy that went back to his office and answered those emails. Again, it was a reward for the trust that we were trying to keep. But it also allowed us an opportunity to just give some levity to what was for several months a very serious and scary time for people. And so the county executive would make a point of at least a couple times a week finding a couple emails that were particularly interesting. Sometimes they were, sometimes they had not so nice things to say. Sometimes they were powerful stories, similar to the letter from the farmer in Kansas. But it gave folks something to hold on to and look forward to. And similarly, we had a reporter who for several months made a point of asking, and subsequently us looking for, and which worked out, what's the good news today? Talking about neighbors lost, a number of cases, people out of work. What's the good news? What's a reason to look forward to tomorrow? But overall, even to this day, we do briefings still Mondays and Thursdays. Our social media interactions are just valuable. Just undersells what they've become for us as resources. Folks on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, they still want the data, they still want the information. And what we've learned through phone calls and emails is that they often go to our social media pages. They're looking for us to just give them the status update for the day. And not to repeat myself, but I will, that trust and us being able to drive folks to social media has allowed us, I would argue, to communicate with the public more effectively when it came to reopening, and also important news conferences going forward. They become conditioned, essentially, for the lack of a better word, to knowing that if they want to know what's going on, they can most likely find it at the Onondaga County Twitter page or the Onondaga County Facebook page. And that's true for most of Central New York, because we try to approach it from a regional perspective. I mean, the saying we had here before COVID, in fact, it was the theme of the county executive's State of the County, which was just a few weeks before this sort of all happened, was "We're all in this together." And that subsequently became the national slogan for how we needed to approach this pandemic. And that was not new to us. It's how we approached all of this as a county and as a region. We appreciated it from the state perspective, and we'll continue to operate that way as we enter this new normal of COVID. But all of that being said, I will. I know we're getting low on time, so I will just stop talking, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Justin. We had a question come in, and I can pose this to both of you, but maybe I'll go Justin first and then let Andrew hop in. A questioner asked, so that they're having difficulty with social gatherings where folks don't social distance or wear masks. Do you have any suggestions that our viewers of this could take home about how to engage in a public information campaign that effectively communicates that message? Like what lessons did you learn from your own outreach efforts about what seems to effectively move people to adhere to those masking guidance?
Yeah, so timely question, because the county executive was actually asked about this pretty specific question at a briefing on Monday. And we had a very early on, when kids came back to SU, there was a small blip where 150 plus kids got together, shouldn't have. Masks were deemed optional by some, and it caused some problems. Not necessarily with a spike in cases, but in a concern of whether or not these kids could take it seriously. And then not that long ago, we got some pictures of some high school kids who are now finally getting back together, groups of maybe under 50, but no social distancing and no masks. And so the county executive was asked, how do you deal with this? And it might sound a little aggressive, but quite frankly, his answer was, there needs to be a degree of public shaming, is probably a bit aggressive, but essentially that's what it amounted to. And that's what happened at SU. And there has not been a single problem since, knock on wood. Kids got the message, they got it quickly. It happened with, like I said, with these high school kids. And no one's looking to, even the media, they're not looking to vilify these people whatsoever. I mean, you're a high school kid. We all were high school kids at one point. We were at it when there wasn't a global health pandemic, but the instincts don't change. So it's just a matter of, there needs to be a little bit of, you need to be unafraid to call it out, call it what it is, and remind them to be smart. And they either have a choice. They either can have some short-term pain, wear a mask, social distance. Let's buy some time for science to catch up with therapeutics, a vaccine, and let's hope that the rest of your high school career or college career is what the rest of us experienced. But that's only going to happen if you're smart in the short term.
Andrew, did you have any thoughts on that one?
I agree with Justin. I think about the shaming, I actually do think it sort of works. I mean, ultimately it's up to sort of individuals to call out one another, or just don't go if you know that there's going to be a gathering like where a lot of people aren't wearing masks. You'd hope that a lot of people would say, well, I actually don't want to put myself in that situation. That's pretty risky. And I think some of the like emphasizing the clusters that have occurred on college campuses already at various events, I think is a good way of kind of illustrating that point. We actually just put out a video on Monday with Paul Rudd that you might have seen. That's like trying to kind of appeal to Gen Z and millennials to try to get them to wear masks. We'll see if that has any like actual effect, but I do think that public shaming, I mean, that's sort of the oldest really trick that has always existed in terms of influencing society's behavior.
Great. We've got another question. It says, is there any advice for many rural counties with limited media and internet access? I know that's challenging for us in this very sort of digitally focused workshop. But if a significant portion of your audience was unable to access reliable high-speed internet, do you have any suggestions of how you could adapt your strategy to try to accommodate that? Putting you guys on the spot here.
Andrew, I'll let you go first on this one.
Okay, Joseph. I think obviously it would be really hard to watch a press conference live if you had poor internet. During the worst of the pandemic, the governor's press briefings were actually carried live by CNN and MSNBC, so people would have been able to watch them on cable TV. Obviously, not everyone probably will be able to get their briefings aired on TV live, but oftentimes local media will, still talk about, local news channels will still talk about what you announce. So I think, making sure you have a really good relationship with local news, then they can kind of speak for you on some of these issues. And I do think that like most people probably have at least like, their Facebook on their phone, and can at least check in on Facebook and see if there's any updates, or on Twitter. You don't need terribly high-speed internet or a really good 4G LTE to be able to go to Twitter once a day or something. So I still think there's still value in social media in these areas.
So I would just piggyback off of that and say that's where at least our approach locally was knowing the pockets of your community. So when you have a rural community, which we have in Onondaga County, I mean, we're sort of like a mini example of New York State. We've got rural, we've got suburban, and we've got a city. That's where you still have to use your traditional media outlets. You're going to rely on your local news stations. You have to make a more concerted effort to reach out to your local radio stations. We made a point of trying to be on at least twice a week, the local talk show here in the afternoon, just to give the update. And truthfully, that's all it was. As much as Easy can be sucked into insulting or complimenting or any of that politics stuff, we just made a point of going on to be like, here's where we're at, sort of an abbreviated version of what folks could find on social media. So social media, I guess I would just say, is it's not the answer to everything. It's not going to replace what we do in our traditional communication role.
Hmm. Right. And but it also has the opportunity to be picked up and amplified by traditional media sources.
Right.
A lot of those Facebook Live briefings I saw from around the state, I think were carried in other venues. Another question for me is, Andrew touched on this a little bit, maybe with as it relates to their testing of ads, but whether it be formal testing or just anecdotally, what surprised you throughout this process where you're, there's no playbook and you're building the plane in midair and you're trying different things? What surprised you the most? What challenged your assumptions? What either worked when you didn't think it was going to work or flopped when you thought it was a winner? What was something from this that really surprised you that you'll take away from this experience?
I can go first. That's a good question. I think that one of the things we found through like A/B testing and stuff was we actually wanted to find the answer to the question, what works more, appealing to people's sense of altruism or people's sense of self-interest? Like, is it better to say protect yourself and your own health, or protect the health of the public or your community, neighbors, etc. I'm not saying this is like a perfectly scientific study, but what we found was actually that the appeals to self-interest were more effective than the appeals to altruism. So take from that what you want in terms of what it says about our audience, but that surprised me, because I actually think that they've done similar studies in Europe that they found that appeals to altruism were actually more effective. So in America, it seems like it might be the opposite.
So for me, we all knew to a degree, right, that social media was popular and powerful. But what surprised me the most was how. And my example of that is the county executive always had two interpreters next to him. One did American Sign Language, and we have actually pretty significant deaf Nepalese population here in Central New York. And so we always have someone signing in Nepalese. So, that was always curious to people. And once we explained it, they were fine. I want to say maybe a month and a half in, I get an email from the interpreters. And what they sent me was how our briefings that we were doing were being sent literally to the country of Nepal, because they were not getting the information that they needed. So I'm not sure how effective the information about how County Central New York was doing to the country of Nepal, but they literally were taking our briefings and sharing them internationally. And they were sharing with me the responses they were getting from that community to the information we were providing. And so it was probably at that time that it hit me that, we all know how serious and important this is, but the real value and power of social media and messaging appropriately.
Right. And then I think in the absence of any many other questions coming in, maybe we'll end on this on a lighter note. Could you talk a little bit about the role of humor in these communications? I just off the top of my head, I can think of sort of the recurring joke of it's Saturday that the governor is still continue to employ. How do you find that balance? What is the role of humor in social and fun in general in social media communications in the middle of a very serious situation? How do you balance those two things? How do you find that point? Is it, personally, it's always hard to know where that line is between a great tweet and a disaster. But if you can talk about your experiences sort of navigating that role, the role of humor, and what it can bring to the table when done right.
So I'll grab this one first. Humor, never doubt the people to give you the humor you need to either share or get you through the day. That sort of goes to what I was explaining earlier with the emails that we would get, which in any other world or circumstance might make your blood pressure boil, and you would read them and all you could do was laugh. But locally, there's a gas station here locally that is known for its very clever billboard signs it puts out, and it changes them like every month or so, and they're just humorous anecdotes. And the best one I saw, which we tweeted, and it's still to this day, I think nothing can beat it. They put up, this was March 30th, so we're height of COVID-19. You thought dogs were hard to train. Look at all the humans that can't sit and stay. And that right there summed up, I think, where we were initially. Some more people than we realized didn't get, you just needed to sit and stay at home. And that ended up taking off like fire. And I certainly am not going to say that tweet is the reason folks started to maybe listen up, but it helped sort of joke about something, but also in sort of like a passive aggressive, like, yeah, this is funny, but like, can you please stay home?
Yeah, no, I think humor can be a very, very effective strategy, especially when you're trying to communicate something that's slightly boring. You need to find a way that people will stop in their feeds, stop scrolling, and pay attention to it. So I think I gave an example of the contact tracing graphic. We're saying, don't answer this call from your ex, but answer the call from the contact tracer. I apologize if someone who seems to be vacuuming near me in the background. So I think humor can be really effective. I also think that it's important to strike a balance, and I think that if you go overboard, you might start to kind of lose some of the credibility or trust that you've earned, because in a situation like COVID, especially in March and April, like, there wasn't really anything funny about it. And I mean, it was pretty horrible. So there would have been certain things that would have been completely unacceptable to joke about, like, obviously, like, people dying or being hospitalized or intubated because of it. But I think when you can find a way to inject levity, that's really important. And also, I'll just say, like, also as just for your staff and for everyone working for you, it's so important to keep a good sense of humor about things too, because there were days that were really stressful and extremely anxiety inducing, and it was really important to be able to, like, occasionally take a break and laugh about something together.
Great. All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up and let everybody get back to their busy days. But I want to thank everybody for attending this virtual fall seminar workshop about communicating in the time of COVID. I especially want to thank our speakers, Andrew Mitchell, Justin Sales. Thanks so much, guys. This is fantastic. I know I've taken a lot away from it. I'm sure our viewers did too. We truly appreciate you taking some time out of your schedules to share your insights with us. So you can find this recording, a recording of this webinar, and a copy of the slide deck on our website at nisac.org/fall seminar. And we hope to see you at the next workshop, which is Leadership in the Time of COVID, which is at 2 p.m. this afternoon. So until then, thanks for reviewing and stay healthy.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks,
guys.